On this episode of Empowered Returns, I welcome Dom Beveridge, principal at 20 for 20, to discuss his recent white paper on centralization for third-party management. We dig deep into the work that still needs to be done when operating properties at scale, but also some of the promising signs to see more organizations move to centralizing and functionalizing their operations in a way that drives substantially better outcomes for more properties and more residents. All right. Hey, Dom, I'm excited to have a chat with you here about your brand new white paper, Centralization for Third-Party Management. It's as I mentioned when we were prepping for this, I think it's a seminal, important piece of industry research that is really full of unique insights. I've read it sort of front to back twice, have notes taken, and I've learned a lot about it, and I am excited for the audience here to dive in as well. But welcome, excited for the conversation.
Yeah, good to be back, and thank you for helping to further this conversation, which, as I say in the book, is the one that I think the industry needs to be having right now.
Yeah, well, without a doubt. This is sort of about you and the white paper, so I'm not going to get on my soapbox too much. But those are the people out there who know about me. I talk about centralization and our way of thinking about it a lot, and I think it is a critically important piece of the puzzle in multifamily to make better investments and help residents live better within the properties themselves as well. But maybe, do you want to start, Dom? Just give us a little bit of an overview of the paper, like where it came from. How did you research and write the paper?
Yeah, so I've been looking at centralization for probably 2 or 3 years through various publications that I've been writing. I sort of noticed, gosh, it was a couple of years ago, I started to notice, particularly when you would listen to technology providers talking about centralization, they were talking a long way ahead of the progress that I was seeing in the industry. You would have been forgiven for thinking, "Oh wow, everybody's doing this right now," and it was really not reflective of the reality of conversations that I was having with senior people at the time. And really, last year, one thing I particularly started to notice is, centralization is a really hot topic. It's covered by multiple panels at every industry conference that you go to. But the conversation felt to me like it's really kind of stalled out a bit over the last couple of years. And in particular, I just really started to notice that you just keep seeing this rehashing of stuff that companies like REITs and other operators that operate like REITs are doing. And just a general, very big hobby horse of mine for the last couple of years has been this observation that our industry keeps getting more and more third-party managed. Like, it's way more third-party managed than it was a decade ago. And each year, the proportion of properties that are third-party managed keeps going up, which is very interesting. We can certainly talk about that. But it feels to me like more and more people came into the industry on the ownership side over the last decade or so, and they generally don't in-house management. So the sector of the management portfolios have been growing much more quickly than the ownership portfolios. So if you sort of put all of that together, it's like, well, I know that a third-party manager can't do the same things that a REIT does, right? There are very fundamental differences in the way that those businesses operate, and it has really important implications for third-party management. And so around the middle of last year, I got into a conversation with Tyler Christiansen, the CEO of Funnel. Funnel have been pushing, you're really trying to develop the conversation around centralization across the industry. And what I said to Tyler was, I think the conversation that we should be having as an industry, if we really want to figure out where centralization is going to ultimately go, the conversation we should be having is about how do third-party managers, most of the industry, how do they get access to the benefits of this thing that we're calling centralization? And that's basically how we got off on this path of researching it.
Yeah, awesome. I think, and that's critically important, not to gloss over the fact that centralization, and those of us that have been paying attention for years to it, it feels like it's been talked about forever and ever, but there's been some traction, but not a lot. And a key piece, and the difference here is, I think, what we're specifically, and what your white paper is, and what you just mentioned, is third-party management. It's a lot more difficult to implement centralization or centralization structures across a third-party management portfolio and not as a direct owner operator. So that's a key distinction, and why this is so important in my view, to talk to the owners and third-party managers out there who can continue to drive this push to centralization forward.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it sort of requires you as well to sort of think about a couple of structural things about the industry. I mean, it's helpful to think about both the structure of the work that's being done, but also the relationships between the companies and the makeup of the portfolio. Like when you start to sort of unpackage that, you realize that the differences are pretty big, particularly those affecting third party management.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so maybe we can dive into that a little bit and talk about, I know in your white paper, you speak to the different functions as part of the property management overall. And maybe we can dive into that because, you probably know, we've talked about this before. I actually don't like the word centralization because I think that glosses over what some of this really is all about. And really, in my mind, it's more about the idea of functional specialization. But I think you aptly described the various functions that are required as part of a property management. Do you want to dive into that and how that might come into play in a centralization operational model?
Yeah. Well, so the frame I've been using for understanding, because my particular interest is I really want to know specifically what people have done. Like when I do my annual interviews, I want to know what people have done over the last year. Like again, when you look at the presentation on an industry panel, it kind of sounds like everybody's the same, right? It's everybody's doing the same kind of stuff because that's just what panels are like. But when you really get into going through details with individual companies, you get a handle on specifically what things they're changing about their business. And I found that the most useful way to look at it is to sort of separate front office from back office, right? So or front office from like maintenance. So maintenance is one thing. Front office, you've typically got two main domains of work: property admin and leasing. It's interesting. Centralization does. I mean, we're sort of stuck with this term, but it does look less and less satisfactory, especially when you start to think about those different domains of work. Like so, admin very much lends itself to centralization. Like if we think of centralization as somebody is going to sit either in a contact center or in some virtual environment where it doesn't matter where they're located, doing work on behalf of properties, that sounds like a good definition of centralization. When you think of something like leasing, where what's really being done is not the same thing as what you're doing for admin, right? With leasing, it's much more like, well, we're going to make more of our stuff self-serve, so there's less leasing work to do, but we still need some people to go meet with prospects and do the activities that we need to do to close leases. So it's sort of some combination of making our technology enable self-serve leasing, and sort of redeploying leasing resources within a region. Like that's a very different thing you're doing now from the thing that we talked about with property admin. And then you've got maintenance, where, I mean, the thing with maintenance is you just can't automate away that much of maintenance. You can do some work order avoidance. You can get smarter about how you triage and dispatch stuff and how you organize things. But until they've got robots that can fix dishwashers, somebody still has to show up and do the work. So again, the thing that we're calling centralization really doesn't look that centralized at all. It's much more like sort of regional organizational redesign, or something like that would be a better description of what we're doing. But it's interesting what you see with these interviews with third-party managers is, up to now I've been thinking about two sort of discrete roles of admin, which in a typical sort of 300 unit multifamily deal is usually done by the assistant property manager mainly. And then you've got leasing, which is predominantly done by leasing agents. What you're finding now, as people start to figure out ways to move admin activities, because always admin is the thing that people focus on first, because it's the one that adds the least direct value to the residents, right? It doesn't have to be done close to where the resident is. Mm-hmm. So that's always the thing that they take off site first. But what's interesting is it's not a one-for-one thing that we took this individual and we put them in a call center. It's more like we took their work and now we have to decide what the remaining people at property do. So you can tell the more people centralize, the more blurry that line between leasing and admin is going to become.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it from my point of view too. And I think we've sort of differentiated the admin part of it. Of course, that's sort of, and it seems to be and is the easiest and lowest hanging fruit to centralize all that part that doesn't need to be closest to the customer or closest to the resident. But I think that this centralization idea provides a massive opportunity to create roles where the people who are closest to the resident or need to be closest are people who can really dramatically impact the experience. Mm-hmm. And sort of the way we think about it is sort of that there's a big part of that that's the experience piece, as a benefit of experience, ideally, driving things like retention and resident experience and referrals that can lead to better sort of revenue outcomes, so to speak. But yeah, no, I'm glad you separated the functions and sort of really dove into each of those components and how that might work. And before we dive into that, I sort of would love to hear about what did you come across in terms of some of the constraints that are preventing a faster move to centralization in a third-party model, and what, because if everybody's seemingly talking about it, but it's been slow moving, what is the cause of that slow motion, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that in a couple of ways. I mean, the sort of proximate reason for that, the thing that immediately stops people from making progress on it, is the fact that for a third-party manager, this is not primarily an operational issue. It's primarily an issue about the commercial relationship that I have with my owners, right? So if you think about how deals come together, everybody agrees on a pro forma for the property. The operator's job is to deliver those pro forma expectations. That pro forma is enshrined in an operating model, where part of the pro forma, in an operating agreement, a property management agreement, where part of that is we've agreed a number of full-time equivalents, a number of staff that's going to be there. We've agreed how much they're supposed to cost. So all of that detail is kind of enshrined in an agreement, and any change you're going to make to your operating model means we have to revisit that commercial arrangement. So that substantially complicates everything. It puts a much sort of higher bar on any changes that you're going to make as an organization. So that's the sort of proximate thing that people have to get past. The sort of ultimate thing, the thing that really makes this more difficult, is to do with these two attributes that multifamily portfolios have. One is the extent to which the operator has control of the environment. So if you think about a REIT, they can do pretty much whatever they want to do. They own all of the resources. They don't have to ask anybody's permission to go do something. If you think about third-party managers, everything that they do requires a decision be made by their owners, right? So that's one big difference. And the other thing is you have this, particularly when you think about the examples that get really, really heavily used in discussions about centralization, how close together the properties are is a really big factor. So if you're UDR or Avalon Bay or one of these companies, you have many, many properties that are close together where you have control over what they do. So you've got the absolute perfect environment for, if you think particularly about leasing and maintenance, the only levers you've really got to drive those things are, if I'm trying to reduce the amount of staff that I need, is I'm going to share resources between properties. Well, maintenance, it takes a really small amount of windshield time to erode the benefits of sharing people between properties. So you need stuff that's close together. So how close together my properties are, and and if you think about that from a third-party management perspective, the more companies attempt to be sort of national platforms, the more sort of diffuse their portfolios get. So the more they find that they've got properties that are just quite a long way away from one another. So the fact these ideas of control and proximity are ultimately what makes this harder, particularly in the third party management model.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it becomes exceedingly difficult if you're managing portfolio with a wide geographic base. It's just to your point, the idea of, I like the term windshield time. Actually, that's funny, but yeah, but you're losing a lot of the efficiencies when you have a lot of unused time, so to speak. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, no, actually,
It's
let me add one other thing that I forgot to mention. So the other thing that really I hadn't fully internalized until I started interviewing some leaders who are affected by this. When we talk about owner operators in the industry, again, we tend to think about that REIT model where owner operator means I own all the properties, I get to decide what to do with them. Again, most owner operators are not like that either. Like most owner operators, like Greystar, for example, is I think the biggest or the second biggest owner of multifamily real estate in the industry. But they only have a relatively small share of the equity in any of the properties that they run, so they can't run. They have an equivalent portfolio to like Mid America, but they can't operate like Mid America because all of their real estate, every decision they make, you have multiple JV partners, which means it's at least as difficult as trying to get things done in the third party management world. So the stuff I just talked about in terms of control is also it's not just that REITs are not that representative of the industry; they're not even all that representative of owner operators.
Yeah, no, it's a great point because exactly when the illustrations have all been from the REIT world or others with full complete control over the entire asset base. Yeah, it's a really completely different animal than third party operators, third party managers, or even owner operators. In the case where you said whether it's multiple special purpose vehicles or JVs or even in the context of a fund in some cases that just make it exceedingly difficult to make those types of choices to go in a different direction, even though it's I would argue is very apparent that this moving in this direction is a better operating model. And frankly, by the way, not just for cost savings, in our opinion, and maybe you can speak to this, but also for better, better outcomes overall. So again, I go back to sort of resident experience and better and revenue. And we've spent a lot of time attacking the sort of revenue side of the coin with, higher occupancy, higher occupancy, much faster releasing, less turnovers, lower turn costs, all the things that can really drive the revenue side of a budget in a substantial way as well. And so it's interesting because we think that this concepts of centralization drives those outcomes a lot better. It's not just about cost savings in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, a couple of things. I mean, just on the revenue side, even companies who haven't changed anything about their operating model yet, other than that they've got a contact center and the contact center has a centralized view of properties, right? So they keep records of Mike DiMella, not records of individual properties, which has always been the way that it's done. Even just having that ability, so that if you don't have an apartment that fits your requirements in this community, we can recommend another one. Just that change, it's usually between sort of 15 and maybe 20% of leads that you get that leased in a community that wasn't the first community they contacted. Mm-hmm. So just having that capability, that visibility, seems to automatically make you more efficient in the way that you can convert leads. Another sort of slightly longer term idea, a veteran of third-party management I was talking to this morning about this was saying that like increasingly single family is a source of competition for talent, right? Like with multifamily, and lots of their stuff works better. Like lots of their stuff lends itself more to careers, particularly if you think about things like maintenance, where you've got the way that maintenance runs in scatter site multifamily and single family stuff that you've been obviously very, very familiar with. It lends itself more to developing more specialized careers for people, which is better. And so there is also this compulsion that we need to figure this out because it gives us more flexibility. It will probably help retention. Like there's all these other things besides simply just looking at this as a cost containment exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you flagged that as well, because I thought that was one of the nice things about your paper is that it does include the employee and operating company benefits too, which are I think super important because we need to attract more talent in the industry to deliver better client service, to better outcomes for residents and owners, but also just for career enjoyment, growth, fulfillment in within a job. And I think I'm sure you've seen lots of the stats like all of us have, is the turnover in this industry from an employee standpoint is massive. And it's, one of the highest turnover industries in the US. And so this is the other, I think, big thing that is important to drive centralization with, because we need to solve for that problem as well. So I'm glad you kind of gave that some attention in this white paper as well. So on that note, maybe we can dive into some examples of how companies have started to look at successfully centralizing third party and kind of going into the various functions, and how some operators are moving into that direction, and sort of really just diving into what has worked and what hasn't. And maybe along with that too, I think if there are any examples that came up or anecdotes or stories about how this has led to better results would be useful too, because I know one of the constraints is a lot of owners and asset managers are risk averse and don't want to sort of move to this model unless it's proven, even though they know it's the right thing to do in their, in their brain somewhere, and they've spoken to that as you referenced in the white paper. But so anyway, I'd love to know what has worked and what hasn't worked within each of this the functions that you speak to in the paper.
Yeah, so the most I think the most important thing to understand, and I didn't fully appreciate this until it's interesting. I interviewed a bunch of leaders of third party management companies, and then once I got my ideas together on that, I then went and shared some highlights with a group of asset managers to get their views on this as well. And so I have a pretty good feeling about how this conversation is currently going in the industry. And the thing with the thing that I really came to understand after I spoke with asset managers about this is that because there is both an operator and a manager involved, it means that decisions always boil down to individual properties, right? So again, if I'm a REIT or a company that operates like a REIT, I get to think about this set of resources that I own in a particular market and what's the most optimal way of redeploying them, right? So they think about this in terms of their operating model. Nobody thinks about it that way when it comes down to making decisions for third party management. It's much more like, all right, this third party manager has developed this shared service model, and here's how I buy into this service to get to replace property based admin with centralized admin, right? They will immediately think, which of my properties is this likely to work at, right? So, so again, they're not thinking about my portfolio; they're thinking about where do I try this out, right? And if you think about that, what that means is that there's this all or nothing element to this. So rather than saying, I can split 5 resources between 8 properties rather than have 1 per property, which again is how a REIT might think about it. It's much more the case where an asset manager is being asked to decide, okay, this associate who currently works at property, they are either going to be 100% off or 100% on this property. That's the decision I have to make. So it's quite a big switch to flick for them. So they have to be sort of convinced of, all right, well, and by the way, what really interested me about the asset managers, I expected them to have much more of a cost saving mentality about this. And really, that was not their primary concern. Their primary concern was, if I would take this one person off site, what does that do to my customer experience? Does that jeopardize my revenue? Like they were much more thinking about it from that perspective. So, they were thinking about things like, all right, well, various of my third-party managers are offering me an alternative. They've got a commercial model and they've got a shared service model, so I can make this switch. But how real do I think the savings are, given that there are bound to be teething problems with this? We're probably going to have to hire
Mm.
temporary people to come support the operation so that the remaining people on site don't feel overloaded with work. So they tend to sort of look at it from that perspective. So if we think about, I mean, one of the sticking points, I'm curious if you get this with the properties that you work with, but one of the real sort of sticking points with it, the two collaborators, the operator and the owner, have to get past is office hours, right? So
Mm.
most of the, if you take 100% of the assistant property manager's work offsite, you still got this coverage problem, right? So I still have to cover the office for a certain number of hours. That seems like a real sticking point, at least at the moment, for lots of asset managers. They feel that, and I guess it's to do with the period that we're in right now, because there's a lot of new supply in lots of markets.
Hmm.
There's this really heightened sense of risk about missing any person coming to the leasing office, right? So
Right.
so a sticking point is often going to be, well, we don't want to change the office hours, and then what more and more of the third party managers tell us is it doesn't matter. Like we've actually researched this pretty thoroughly. It doesn't matter if we close one day a week. It doesn't matter if we reduce the number of hours. It doesn't matter if we make lots of our services by appointment only. In fact, people quite like that.
Hmm.
But that's a bridge that they haven't quite crossed with lots of asset managers just as of yet.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think that is a complete red herring and is not a problem whatsoever in so many ways. And I think principally, though, this is where I think it's important to bifurcate the idea of leasing versus resident experience. And so, especially for leasing, the fact that you've got someone sitting at a desk waiting for someone to walk in because it might be a lead that might rent an apartment is completely backwards.
Mm.
Like, you should be out there, with sales professionals who are working on appointment on demand, and that's way more powerful. And then focused on investing in the appropriate marketing to drive demand, and not just hoping for a walk by, walk in that someone's sitting there that can grab. So
Mm-hmm.
that's nonsensical, and we've proven that out with results after results after results, no doubt about it. I'm sure many others have as well. I think the other side of the coin, though, is this idea of like the residents who are in the property currently, and they want to be able to see a face and talk to someone and not have to call into a call center. And I totally get that. That's the resident experience. But like an idea of operating that like on a schedule, on appointment hours, types of things also makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. Of course, there's got to be a function that emergencies and maintenance gets called in, but I think you can do these things in a specialized way a whole lot more efficient than you can be just hoping that you got three people on site at a 300 unit property and just so there's coverage at the office. That's just extremely wasteful.
Yeah, no, it's true. It does sort of feel like a sort of sacred cow as well. And I mean, I guess it's because, I mean, unlike you, the people making those decisions, they're being asked to move away from something, to give up something that they currently have. So the bias is always to be like really, really risk
Mm,
averse there.
totally.
But yeah, I agree. It does. This does really feel like a kind of sacred cow that the people have to get past. And people have. I mean, Mark Taylor was one of the good examples who've really sort of pushed this model. They've gone to they just made a lot of their services by appointment only, and they generally see it as something that just seems to work a lot better.
Hmm.
If you want to see a face at the property, you can. It's just that you don't automatically get it when you walk into into the office. The other interesting thing, just from a control perspective, you, I think there's a lot of work still needs to be done figuring out which things really need to take place at property and which don't. Like office hours, obviously being one of them. But it's interesting when you look at the sort of tech utopian view of this, that well, we can just make all of this thing, the AI can just do everything for us. One of the interesting things, I was talking to one third party manager about this, and he was saying that the problem with that is when anything goes wrong that affects or looks like it's going to affect the performance of an asset, no asset manager is going to come to you and say, well, what does the technology say? Like if there's a problem with leasing, they're going to say, who's in charge of leasing, right? It's there is just this element where you need somebody who's got an appropriate span of control to be responsible for what's going on at property. And it's more like identifying what those key touch points are that require management, that are needed to deliver the customer experience. We've definitely got quite a lot of work to do as an industry to really figure out what they are, I think.
No, yeah. Well, look, without a doubt, I think that's the thing. And as much as incorporating tech, making things more efficient, better processes with technology and automation and AI, that's all great. But ultimately, you're talking about, for residents, they're one of the most important parts of their lives, their homes, their resident, where they live. It's one of their primal, kind of human needs. And so, that's why it's really critical to not remove the entirety of the experience for people. But it makes no sense to have the things that don't need to be on site to be on site, because otherwise it's just a disruption. So you got someone, sort of doing some of the bookkeeping, collecting rents, whatever it might be, an administrative job, and they get interrupted 14 times over the course of an hour because residents walk in and want to just say hello or whatever. That just totally distracts them, slows them down, is way inefficient. But if you have the person on site whose job it is, and they're scored against the idea of resident satisfaction, retention, renewals, they can meet, greet, have that type of personality who can drive those types of outcomes, can put together whatever might be events or resident events, things like that, to drive those outcomes. That's their job. That's where that can make a lot of sense to have that human interaction. And I think the same thing with leasing too. We've seen a very, I would say, over adoption or rapid adoption in many cases with some of these, people-less or leasing person-less leasing. And the outcomes I've seen so far are far worse leasing outcomes so far. And again, these might change. Technology evolves quickly. But yeah, I think you've got to figure out where the outcomes are best driven by people who are trained and specialized in those right processes, and instead of just a knee jerk to incorporating tech and calling it centralization.
Yeah, the interesting thing with some of the sort of success stories that you can see from some of the big operators, and some of the sort of medium sized operators here as well. It's very, very interesting how everybody isn't treating this with the same level of priority. Like, there's lots of big third-party managers who are just not working on this at all at the moment, irrespective of what they say at conferences. But there's a relatively small vanguard of companies that are really pushing this. And one of the interesting things is that because they've taken admin offsite, when they figured out how to take admin offsite, they created contact centers. Well, in the mainstream of multifamily, it's not normal for companies to have contact centers, right? Because because you've got multiple different owners, cross-selling feels like really messy and complicated because, are you paying too much attention to that owner's properties and not my property? You have that kind of stuff going on. So it's just something that's never really been part of third-party management. But now, because people have spun up contact centers to handle property admin, right? So if you're doing things like move in and move out admin, you're doing deposit handling, like you need some way to talk to you're doing collections as well. You need some way of reaching out to residents and prospects about that. You've now got this capability that didn't exist before, and people are starting to move further and further into stuff that's that's more like leasing. So renewals is one of the good examples of, do you see it as an admin task or do you see it as a sales task? But yeah, once you're dealing with residents and prospects on all this other stuff, like it starts to become less and less of a shorter and shorter step to actually doing more centralized leasing.
Yeah, no doubt. And I always like to sort of talk about it. I think this is still seemingly one of the only industries where you're expecting, your managers to be just a jack of all trades, doing a lot of different functions without a ton of training, without a ton of process in some cases, and just expecting them to move the needle on these outcomes where every other company in America. I mean, if you look at a sales organization in every other company, now they've got not just sales, but they've got different types of sales. They've got inside sales, they've got, business development, they've got revenue operations, they've got marketing, all, sort of, and thinking about these things as a conjoined effort to really drive sort of revenue outcomes. And same thing, like a customer experience, that's job is to, drive retention for software, whatever it might be. Many other industries have totally moved in this direction already. We're sort of far behind in many cases in this industry. I know there's a lot of constraints like the ones you mentioned that prevent the example I just mentioned from happening whole cloth, so to speak. But without a doubt, like I think for me, and one of the things you mentioned in the piece as well is really exciting, is that the companies who are thinking about this from a first principles standpoint are really doing some amazing work. And yeah, there's some growing pains, of course. There are some things to be worked out. But it's exciting to see some of these larger managers and obviously some other mid-sized and smaller ones really moving in this direction, although it's, maybe too far and too well, maybe not. Actually, it's probably good for us, my company here. But I'm excited to see some of the progress. Have there any like unique and interesting things that you were talking to operators that you would sort of highlight or call it as a way to move in the direction?
Yeah, well, let's talk about this idea of first principles thinking, because again, the challenge is in multifamily, we tend to have the habit of reaching for solutions to problems that we're already familiar with, right? So, the typical way that people often engage vendors, for example, is that if they want to solve a particular problem, they'll go ask other people what vendor they're using for this, and that's extremely influential in what technology they sort of end up with. You're never going to solve for this particular problem that way, like especially if you think about something like leasing, right? So if I'm feel very convinced that nobody's going to solve the problem of leasing at third party management by looking at what REITs did, right? You're not going to take that solution and put it into a third party management environment, because it just won't work. Like, you don't have your business is too different from theirs for that to be effective. So the right question to ask is, how should leasing work, right? And candidly, that's the reason why we wanted to use Charlesgate as an example in this. Even you guys are very different in terms of your portfolio, like your geography, style of property, and so on, than the rest of the people in the paper. But you had taken, just because you didn't have any of the priors that these big companies have. You have this way of doing leasing that had evolved, that kind of turns the way that we think about leasing on its head. And the way I characterize it in the paper is, I think the mainstream of multifamily looks at leasing more like a staffing problem than it thinks of it as a sales function. It's like, how do I get leasing agents? How do I staff this high turnover position? How do I train them well enough that they can do leasing? And given that if I'm really, really good at leasing and I'm stuck in one property, that means I'm going to have periods of the year where I have very few apartments to sell. Like, how do we sort of round out this role with a load of other sort of admin kind of stuff? That tends to be the way that we think about it. So you end up being really, really over-indexed on hiring and training these people that sit in properties. Again, it's very difficult to see how you take that model and make it more sort of centralized. What I liked about the Charlesgate model, and what really seemed to capture the interest of other people that I was talking to, is that your model is predicated on properties kind of purchasing leases from the operator. That's a very different way of thinking about it. So it's, when I was talking when Todd was explaining the model to me, I was saying, well, how do you pro forma properties? Because we can all agree that the model in multifamily is very inefficient, but it's also predictable, right? I know how much I'm going to pay in salary costs, which means it's easier to pro forma that property. And when Todd explained to me that, what we do is we're good at predicting how many leases we're going to need to turn in a property. We're good at predicting what cost per lease is going to be across this portfolio. And our owners accept that, because although there's a little bit of uncertainty in it, it ends up being cheaper and you get better quality people. So by
Mm-hmm.
sort of, again, the first principles thing, if you turn the whole thing on its head and say, how does this piece of real estate source leads from the operator, that's much likelier to yield an answer of how you centralize like leasing and multifamily.
Yeah, no, and thanks for highlighting that. I didn't even mean to lead the question there, but thanks for mentioning, and thanks for featuring us in the article. But no, I think that's exactly right. We looked at this from like, what are the outcomes we're trying to drive here? Okay, and you want like, better rents, above or very competitive or above market rents, lower, faster turn times, faster re-rent times, and so and higher occupancy. So how do you solve for those problems, right? And also reducing fixed staffing costs on site that are wasted half the year typically anyway. And so how do you solve for that? And the question is, okay, this makes sense if we can do it in a way such that we're doing we call it on-demand leasing, pay per lease, or pay per lease as you call it. But it makes so much sense, because now you can have a professionally trained sales team who is really good, and their only focus is on leasing, and they're not doing sort of administrative work or having to deal with a maintenance emergency and trying to do leasing at the same time. And also just their oftentimes in the industry, entry level positions that you're just trying to restaff because there's so much turnover, as you mentioned. So yeah, it was sort of just an idea of how do we solve for that? How do we do it in a way that really makes sense and to drive better outcomes? And also, just to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, solve the office hours problem too, because the team they're trained and incentivized to be salespeople, so there's more flexible, work hours by appointment typically. It just solves a lot of problems. And yeah, there's a little bit more uncertainty perhaps added on the ownership side, and frankly, there's a little bit more risk that we as an organization take to employ those people directly and then to sell them to the owners, rather than just having a chargeback cost for another staff on site. So we look at it as like a shared, a more shared alignment for us with the ownership, and as a way to drive better outcomes. And so that's how we thought about it. So, and I think there's other examples in the paper too, where we see similar thinking from other managers that you featured.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting things about that. So, if you one of the sort of bugs with the third-party management model is these platforms can get really, really big, right? You 250,000 unit like platforms, for example, and it still ultimately costs you the same amount to run a property than it does elsewhere. The only economies of scale, maybe you get a better deal on paint and light bulbs and stuff like that, but you might have dozens and dozens of properties in a single market, but you can't access any of the benefits that you should be able to get, because you're stuck with this one staff member per property kind of model, which has no scale to it, right? So for that reason, if you would change the way that you think about providing leasing services in the way that you guys have, if you're Greystar, they've probably got like 100 properties in Dallas Fort Worth or something. Like, imagine if you could figure out exactly how you wanted to deliver leasing services to all of those properties. There'd be huge efficiencies that you could potentially gain. So it's a problem that I think is very much worth like working on. One of the interesting comments that I had, so it's Mariana Estrada from RPM, when we were talking about this very thing, and she was saying that one thing that sort of complicates things in multifamily is that everything in marketing is designed around this highly decentralized model. Everything is designed for a model where individual properties purchase leads from multiple different ILSs. You'd want to progress, if you look at it from an operator like RPM's model, like you'd want to progress to a point where more of that stuff comes to me in each market that I serve, so that I can run things. I can think about what leads I need at more of a market level rather than an individual property level. I can nurture leads at scale through a specialized team. I can I can get better at predicting where my needs are, and leverage marketing costs, for example, across our market. That's like not the way that multifamily works right now, but it kind of should be.
Yeah, no, without a doubt, and that's exactly the difficult constraints, is that so much is decentralized at a property by property basis, rather than combined, centralized, regionalized, whatever, to get those economies of scale. And I think that's the vision. The thought that we have is that that's the direction that this is going in, right? And we think ultimately owners are going to start to want to be paying for actual outcomes, not just for staffing or whatever, but say, okay, let's actually hire a firm, a manager that's going to drive outcomes in a more positive, strong way, and pay them a fee, and they will operate it based on whatever model they might be using. But it's going to be a way to drive more scale, more economies of scale, and better results across portfolios. And again, there's a lot of constraints, as your paper very much highlights, but I don't see there's any other way to squeeze that much more out of a lemon here, from the traditional model, than really kind of rethinking this from the ground up. And that's the direction we're moving in. And again, as fixed costs increase, as all these other, it makes it more difficult to build and develop and own properties. You've got to find a way, and we think there's a lot of opportunity in here too, because to your point, there's literally no economies of scale right now, with few exceptions across the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the way to drive some economies of scale in terms of operating and driving better outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing, I guess, you've got this dynamic where, again, pro formas are all about these individual properties, right? So the performance of each individual asset has this sort of particular this particular like salience. So if you think about the way that you would run scatter site multifamily, where you don't really have that dynamic, you can really look at a region or a submarket as a pool of leases that I need to close, or a pool of like expirations that I need to close. I have these differences with individual properties, right? So if I've got a 300 unit property in a market where there's not that much exposure, an individual property might have a lot, just because of the expirations that it has to happen over that it has to have over a particular period. It means that you end up having this sort of coordination problem between
Mm-hmm.
individual properties and the center. Like, one of the interesting examples, so David Perez of RMR talked about this
Mm-hmm.
example where they kind of started to try and centralize leasing, and they found that they'd sort of overstated, or they had unrealistic expectations about how just the motive to send the talent to wherever the leases need closing. Like, they kind of thought that that's where the financial opportunity is going to be, so that's going to kind of carry the this new process. And they found that you actually need way more control over it than they had originally anticipated. So they ended up having to hire somebody specifically to figure out how to run this process. Even things like, during a leasing process, there's going to be times where you're going to meet with somebody at a property, and then you're going to call back about something, where you call back at a time when that person isn't at property. You go through to a call center. Well, the person
Mm-hmm.
who's calling doesn't want to speak to a call center. So how do you just coordinate these things across these central and local teams that you've now got? Those are the kind of problems that people are trying to figure out how to iron out right now.
Yeah, yeah, without a doubt. And every time you use the word call center, it freaks me out. All I think about is, now this is going to like an airline,
Yes.
system where you got to call a call center. You can't talk to again. Like, that's the wrong way. No, but yeah, you got. So there are some problems you got to figure out, because that's a horrible experience where someone's trying to get in touch with the person they met with yesterday, and they got to go through a call center and a system of menus and some AI bot, and it's just so that's why I with our team here, and when we're talking about, it's always we always want to come back to the idea of what's going to lead to the best outcomes for the resident experience in this case, or if it's leasing, what's going to lead to the best leasing outcome. And there's only so much efficiency that you can drive, and if efficiency is the only goal, that becomes a major problem. But you got to find a way around some of these constraints, because you do want to take you do want to have the efficiencies of something like a call center, perhaps, but not the negatives of it, and that's the challenge. So it's interesting. So what do you think, Dom? And so we got maybe just a couple more minutes here, I think. But what do you think about sort of overall, what's your perspective after this report? I know you've been looking at centralization for a while, but are you positive on the possibilities of centralization? Are you skeptical that it can happen in a third party operator part of the market at scale, or where are you kind of falling on it overall now?
So generally, the level of progress is higher than I thought it would be, right? So I'm generally, I'm cautious about this because you can tell we're at this stage where, I mean, companies are making real traction with this. If I sort of think of the Grey Stars, the BHs, companies like that have big platforms, they're really substantially changing their operating model, and they're getting their owners to sort of come along with them. I can tell also uh, at the same time, even within the same organization, you get different degrees of caution about this. Like, people will over-index on the thing that went wrong and think, well, maybe we're moving too fast on this thing. And so you can tell you're at that stage where there are a lot of points on the board already, but we're far from figured out how this thing will ultimately work. So I just think we're in a very, very interesting couple of years. I think the natural financial pressures in the market will mean that people will figure this out. It's very interesting that so many of the operators are not really working on this at the moment. But again, it won't be that long before this has to be a source of competitive disadvantage, right? I mean,
Right.
this is you guys have been doing this for a long time. This is still new for those big operators, but you have a handful of the operators that I spoke to for whom this is in every pitch that they give to the new potential business. And if they could snap their fingers and convert everybody to this centralized model, then they would, right? So that's indicative of this being like part of their operating model now. There's a slightly bigger swathe of companies that are trying to figure this out. They're just figuring out how to make the model work, or they realize they've got to make some changes to their organization before they can scale it up. Like, they're in that sort of stage of development. So there's just enough progress on this generally that I do think this is the direction the industry is going to go in. But yeah, lots of lessons still to be learned.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm excited about the progress. I think, again, the ability or the opportunity to drive, tangible, positive outcomes for both owners and residents on site by just rethinking how we're operating properties at scale is a really, I think, unique opportunity for a lot of us in the business. And frankly, a lot of us that are really moving rapidly in that direction, including many of the folks you featured in your piece here. So I will definitely, there's a lot of ground you covered in the piece, and a lot of details on various ways to centralize, maintenance and admin and leasing. And examples in there. So I would highly encourage anyone listening to go download the paper if you haven't, read it, take some notes, take it home to the home office, and start putting some lessons into action, so to speak. But John, where can people find you or find the paper if they're looking for it?
Yeah, just go to 20for20.com, 20for20.com. You'll find it. There's a publications page. You can find it there, or it's on the homepage as well. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, just Dom Beveridge.
Awesome. And yeah, definitely follow Dom Beveridge as well. He's full of insights across a lot of aspects, not just centralization. So Dom, awesome, man. Thank you for the conversation. A great piece of work here, as well as many other things. And I'm excited to get a chance just to talk to you again, because I like to catch up and have a great conversation with you as always. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, same. Thanks a lot, Mike.